we are here today with Lisa Middlemiss and Amandeep Hayer, who are, did I say your last name right, Amandeep?
Hair, like
Hayer.
on your head.
Thank you. We've this has been a bit of we had actually canceled our session with them, so they're appearing at a bit of a disadvantage because we called on them and they weren't expecting our call this morning. But we're very glad that you've joined us today to talk about your book that's going to be coming out. What's the actual launch date?
Oh, it's out.
It's out. Okay,
Yes.
it's the actual launch party hasn't happened, but the book is already released.
That's
We've
it.
had a party in Montreal. Now we're having one in Vancouver.
Ah, nice. Nice. Just hasn't reached the West yet.
Yeah.
Get in there. Thanks for the invite.
Yeah, it's lovely to have you both. Lisa, you've not been on the show before, huh?
My first time.
Wow.
Thanks for having
we've
me.
never done a foreign countries immigration before, and you're our go-to Quebec lawyer.
Indeed, it can feel like a foreign country out here in Quebec sometimes.
What
Yeah.
what is going on in Quebec right now? Because I feel like it is driving the immigration narrative. We'll get to the book in a bit, but I do want to just get a sense of a few things to do with Quebec immigration. Like what's going on out there? Because it feels like Quebec's politics are sort of driving the country's.
Nice narrow question for you.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely there's a political side, of course, to the nature of our work, right? And since now, if at least a year or two, I would say there's been sort of a changing tide. The tides have turned, shall we say, in terms of public perception of immigration, especially in Quebec, and not so much in Montreal, which remains literally an island in this province, but more so in the regions and everywhere outside of Montreal, and even in the national capital in Quebec City. I think you could say that there is a certain anti-immigration sentiment among some circles, and the government the caucus government has really made their election platform on certain restrictive policies and cutting back on temporary foreign workers, and especially making making a scene about having too many asylum seekers and how Quebec is paying too much of the bill for that. So it's unfortunate, but the dialogue has changed. And that has in turn led to policy shifts like we saw on September 3rd, where already we were seeing an announcement that we're going to cut back on temporary foreign workers, starting with, here, low wage at the moment. And that was in force even before the feds got on board. But of course, they were all in talks. And so then yesterday, I think it was, we saw the federal version of that roll out and restrictions on low wage LMIAs.
Yeah, people often in other provinces talk about how Quebec has its own immigration system, or that, X province should get the same powers as Quebec. Do you want to maybe briefly just talk about like what powers does Quebec have that is unique in Canada's immigration landscape?
For sure. Yeah. So it all stems back to, I believe it was 1991, the Canada-Quebec Accord. So, which is basically like a quasi-constitutional instrument that was signed around the time of Meech Lake between Canada and Quebec, in which Quebec received certain pouvoirs, some powers over areas of immigration, for example, selection of economic immigrants, whereas other areas were to remain federal as per the agreement. So, for example, anything like asylum seeking or family class is generally more of an overarching federal responsibility. So it's all sort of delineated in that agreement. But over the years, it's been alleged that it's gotten outdated, and Quebec has been seeking to repatriate that instrument and build on its powers. And as far as I understand, is seeking to basically carve out more space.
Yeah, it's been, like in British Columbia, we're in the midst of a provincial election right now, and the leader of the Conservative Party, John Rustad, has said that BC should seek out similar powers that Quebec has. David Eby, the current premier of the MDP, New Democrat Party, was complaining about funding that Quebec gets for temporary residents compared to British Columbia back in June. I don't know, Amandeep, if you're in British Columbia, like Deanna and I, have you gotten a sense at all at like how immigration is playing into the provincial election here.
Have you
Quebec
ever?
bashing is always a thing out west, but like
Yeah, I mean that's
immigration
just our
in
thing, right? So,
particular.
I mean, I'm originally from Alberta. We're so that it's supposed to be in our blood, isn't it? Um,
Oh,
Mm.
but no, like I haven't noticed the immigration issue coming up too much on our side, but I also just note of all the provinces in the country, BC's economy seems to be the healthiest. And I think some of that is playing into why we're not hearing as much about it in the provincial election. You're right, there was some stuff by both EB as well as the Conservative leader, John Rustag, but it's definitely not come up in the actual election campaign. I think other issues have somewhat taken a priority right now. Like, I mean, housing is always an issue here. Um, I've noticed some of the stuff around the downtown east side, some of the crime there that's come up, but it's been a sort of secondary factor. But
Yeah, I
But I
agree. I
mean,
think
at a
those two
national
issues.
level, yeah, for
yeah,
sure. At a national level, we're seeing with that recent squabble between Mark Miller, the immigration minister, and the three provincial ministers. What was it, Alberta with Danielle Smith? What was the other two provinces again?
Nova
Prairie provinces.
Scotia
Scotia.
Yeah,
and New
yeah.
Brunswick.
Okay, not
oh yeah.
okay. Around again the obligations to um to step up where resettlement of asylum seekers is concerned. And obviously this tension is arising across the country about, well, this is something that we have as a national policy, but I think the provinces are all to some extent jarring a little bit about who's going to bear the cost and whether or not they're on board for this type of resettlement. So
Yeah.
again, as you've described, this turn in the tides in terms of public perception of immigration and refugee protection has had an impact both at the federal and at the provincial level pretty profoundly in the last year.
Yeah.
So
Lisa,
interesting.
you would, I was chatting with a immigration lawyer in Vancouver the other day about Roxham Road, which is the New York Quebec crossing where a lot of the refugee flows into Canada were happening at one point. And they were saying, well, Quebec asked for it by requesting
Hmm.
faster work permits for refugee claimants than the rest of the country was receiving. So they've made their bed and can lay in it. And I didn't have the knowledge of what was going on with asylum flows into Quebec to have a good response. Do you know if that's true?
Well, what I've heard is, well, Quebec did ask for the closure of Roxham Road, again, for political reasons, appealing to the base of this majority CAQ government. And there was a large flow of people for sure, a very significant flow of people. But since that border closed, I've heard that levels of asylum are up more at Montreal Trudeau, for example. So people will find a way when you're fleeing, and seeking refuge. That many do find a way one way or another, or others come across, from what I've heard from those who do more refugee law, irregular crossings, I guess, are up in different locations. So, but I'm not the foremost expert on this.
Yeah.
Should we segue into talking about their book?
Yeah. I mean, so the topic is, well, why don't you lead off with the topic?
Me?
Oh no, either of you about like
Yeah,
what made
please.
you choose to talk about maintaining permanent residence, citizenship.
Hmm. It's almost like the topic found us in a way, I would say. We got to work with one another through Eamon Publishing, and the topic was of interest. And I guess they basically put us together. We were jumelés, as we would say in French, and it became basically a 2 year. Was it a 2 year project, Amandeep?
A little more than 2 years, I think. I'm trying to think, when did I think we were still in the early, we were just rolling out the vaccine, I remember, when we
Oh, wow.
spoke. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
So, and we
Feels like
just,
yesterday.
yeah.
But yet so long ago. It's like these mixed feelings. It was a long labor of love, and glad that it's finally been published.
When it comes to like preparing a book over such a period, how do you deal with changes to law? Like, I mean, we've talked a bit on borderlines. There's going to be at some point a big change to citizenship law coming up.
Hmm. Hmm.
How does that, like, as you're writing, do you find that you write a chapter and then, oh Gotta like now rewrite the whole chapter.
Totally.
We well, we had a fun one. We had finalized the book. It was ready for the publisher. And that was the day Bill C-71 dropped.
Oh, no.
You want to summarize Bill C-71 quick for?
Sure. Bill C-71 is it's designed to change more or less citizenship by descent legislation. It is going to expand citizenship to the second generation born abroad. Currently, if you're born abroad to Canadian parents, you're a Canadian citizen. If your parent was born in Canada or naturalized in Canada, if your parent was born outside of Canada, you can only be a Canadian citizen if your parent was, or your grandparent was serving the crown, or yeah, that's the only exemption that applies. That limitation was struck down by the Ontario Superior Court, and I'm not going to try to pronounce the court case name. It's very difficult for me.
Bjorkist?
Bjorkist, yes.
Yep.
That was struck down, and then about 4 months after it was struck down, the government announced this bill. And what the bill is going to do is going to retroactively deem anyone who was born in any generation prior to the passage of the bill to be a Canadian citizen. And then subsequently, it'll only be those who have lived in Canada, whose parents have lived in Canada for 1,095 days over the last 3 years, although there is some contention about whether that might change and be a little bit more restrictive moving forward.
Wow.
Yeah, but as Amandeep said, it was just crazy when, well, I think it even went back to like when the Bjorkist decision broke in the Ontario Superior Court. I think that was in December, just before the holidays of last year. And basically the second generation limitation to citizenship being struck down by the court and ruled as unconstitutional, and basically unfair to some people who had been born abroad themselves and happened to be abroad at the moment that their own children were born. Often were women, and they were, for example, for professional reasons or due to where they were at in their pregnancy, they were not unable to travel back to Canada to give birth to their child, and thus their child was not Canadian, being born abroad in the second generation. And so they really found this case is just amazing. I encourage everyone to read it, and any of the listeners, anyways, because they found sympathetic litigants, and then that led to, as Amandeep was saying, to Bill C-71 and the government trying to fix those injustices.
Mm-hmm. And that's still not actually passed into law. We're still at the bill stage. So and funny, because before the decision came down from the Ontario court, it was sort of settled law what the rules were. Am I right?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean,
It was shocking.
It was a very surprise decision, because I do remember, I think the federal court actually upheld it at one point, if I remember correctly. But then the Ontario Superior Court struck it down, and the government just decided we're not going to appeal this, and we're going to reform this.
It's similar in a way to the habeas corpus litigation, where the federal court has always upheld the detention regime, and then the Ontario court struck it down.
Oh.
But you had an article with Will in the Toronto Star, I believe, Amandeep, talking about the possible numbers.
Yeah. So Will Towner wrote this article. Which is interesting because it feeds off of the previous discussion about a significant anti-immigration trend, but we're potentially looking at millions of people in the US becoming Canadian citizens. The estimate we provided was we just took one group of Canadians living, like descendants of Canadians living in the US, which is Francophone migrants to New England back in the 1920s. If you just take them, about 20% of the population of New England today descends from them. And potentially, we're looking at about 21 million people who will become Canadian citizens overnight.
Or who could potentially, right? Like, depending on, like, because there's the whole question of proof. Couldn't we say, Amandeep, like having to prove generations and birth certificates? And so maybe the numbers aren't as high as like they could potentially be.
Yeah, potentially no. I mean, I'm just talking about a strict legal sense that, they're all going to become Canadian citizens overnight.
Right.
It's going to be, obviously, proof's going to be an issue. But for these, the one thing I should mention with that group, though, we're not talking about that many generations back. We're just going back to the 1910s. It may actually be possible to get proof for all of them if we wanted to.
Need a good lawyer.
Yes. I mean, birth certificates, I think, will become a bit of an issue. But once you factor in websites like Ancestry, I'm sure we can start piecing it all together. the other group, I mean, if you start going really far back, I mean, we could be potentially going to everyone who can trace their lineage back to the plains of Abraham. And if you go back that far, then you're potentially talking about God knows how many, but proving that will be very difficult because how far back can you go and get accurate records?
Yeah, and we're part of a Canadian Bar Association working group, and it seems like the government is sort of taking the position that this wouldn't apply before there was actually such thing as the Canadian citizenship in 1947. So I think they're looking at that as a cutoff date. It's not apparent though on the face of the legislation. I think we could say.
Yeah, I think we had some meetings with the minister officials, and they said, well, there was no citizenship before January 1st, 1947, which, if you know Canadian history, there was. It was just not Canadian citizenship. We were British subjects. But if you start looking both at the bill as well as Section 3(1), and you just start playing with how the two interact, it starts to open up this page where this could be going back really far. And that was the interesting bit.
It's a bold feat to try and muddle through Canadian citizenship law. I was saying to Steve before we started recording that when a case comes through and they start with, I think I might be a Canadian citizen. My mother, I'm like, refer. Refer.
The lost Canadians.
The lost Canadians. And I find the law just so perplexing, the way that it's not like you can read the Citizenship Act and get a full answer to the question. So I would love to hear one of you just describe the kind of nature of how the interreferential nature of Canadian citizenship law, because I don't think that it's similar to most other legislation that we see. And I don't think most people are aware of it until they've gone on one of these escapades of trying to help a client figure out whether in fact they're Canadian citizens.
So my joke on this is the one time millennials don't get to complain that we're on the short end of the stick. If you go read the Citizenship Act, it says everyone is a Canadian citizen if they're born in Canada after February 15th, 1977. Everyone is a Canadian citizen if they're born outside Canada to a Canadian parent after February 15th, 1977. And then with the first generation limit a little bit further down, and then it lists off a bunch referring to acts that no longer exist. And these go back to acts going all the way back to Confederation, if not further back than that. And then it just becomes this game. Okay, well, one, was this person born in Canada, like ancestor born in Canada? Okay, the first person generation born abroad, did they properly register their birth? You just keep going down. And where it starts getting even more complicated, that first generation limit, it doesn't apply equally. It only applies to people who are born after, I believe, April 17th, 2009. So before April 17th, 2009, it just gets into this bigger convoluted mess where if every single step was taken appropriately, there's a good chance that person is Canadian.
We used to have a binder, like a physical binder in our office with all the various pieces of immigration legislation. And I remember when you had to go all the way down the wormhole, you were at this, therefore and where not, all that kind of legislation in that old script version. And that's why I started to my queasiness would increase each time I descended further down that wormhole.
Yes, I share that a bit too. And if this were a game of chess, you would never want to play against Amandeep because he is natural at this way of going back into history. Literally, it's amazing, Amandeep, what you can do, and the way that you can identify, depending on whether it was the mother or the father, the lineage is traced back to whether there could be a title to Canadian citizenship. Because as Amandeep is saying, the rules were not equal, and there were different preconceptions about how citizenship would be passed on based on marital status or gender. So that was a really interesting thing to dig into, and Amandeep is really a guru in that sort of game, if you will.
It's fascinating. I remember at one point the government put one of those wizards on their website to be like,
Yes.
am I a Canadian citizen? Yes or no? And then you would do conditional logic, whatever. And then I think they eventually removed it because even, with the, so, I would have loved for there to be, there should, in my view, be a pretty clear tool to this. And I'm just kind of wondering what your thoughts are about like rule of law and this
Yes.
this act, the idea that it does need somebody who can be a natural historian to come, is this normal? Is this correct? Or like, I've always wondered why we can't just write a new Citizenship Act that puts everything that is required to establish whether or not you're a Canadian citizen in a single piece of legislation that doesn't require you to do a historical analysis.
Although if they did that, they might lose people again. Then we'd just be back to where we are.
Yeah, we'd have a few more lost Canadians out there and lost counsel maybe, but no, I think it's time, and we talk about that in the book too. Like a spoiler alert about exactly that. Like, you know, at a certain point, and Bill C-71 is certainly not airtight, nor is it easy to read, nor is it easy to follow. So it's a bit mystifying at some point why they just haven't decided, like, this is a major revamp. This would be the time to do it. If any time, it's now, but we don't see that at the moment. And
I
unless
think the
there's some.
politics of it now, like the conservatives already kind of have
Mhm,
their attack angle, which is at a
mhm,
time that the population is soaring, like as it is, as Amandeep noted, there could be millions of people who all of a sudden become citizens.
I'm
mhm,
going to
At
note
the same
something.
time, they have this court decision that they have to comply with. So
Mm.
I'm
there's a
going to
bit of,
note something about that though. I was listening to the Conservatives in the House of Commons. They're not opposing the retroactive granting of citizenship. They're opposing it prospectively. So
mhm,
what they're just going after is that 1,095 days over good quality to the period of life. They're saying it should be 1,000 consecutive days. That's the only thing which is in contention, which I found very surprising because I would have thought this would have been easy line of
oh,
attack.
interesting. I thought I'd heard a few MPs talking about how there's not going to be security screening of the individuals involved because they would be Canadians, which kind of
mhm,
ties into the recent ISIS stuff. It's a
mhm.
super difficult one. I remember in 2006, the Lebanese
Yes.
war, in the
Mhm,
Yes.
lead up to when they brought in the citizenship by descent restrictions,
mhm,
the public was pretty annoyed. Ironically, there's now another war in Lebanon about to break out, but where people were being rescued who were Canadian citizens, but hadn't seemed to have ever really lived in Canada, which led to the restrictions on citizenship by descent. We've almost now come full circle with yet another possible war in Lebanon at a time of debating a citizenship bill. But
Yeah, it's odd, isn't it? Just a circle. It's a circular thing, but I agree. I guess they're worried about this potential to have to, get people out, like in Haiti too, or in other places where we may need to come to the rescue for to people who are Canadian. You know, but at the same time, it's a little bit of a false fear because usually the government, in my opinion, global affairs, like they give people fair warning, and I don't know, it's hard to envision. In my opinion, I'm not so concerned about the numbers because I think that it will not be so easy, even if these people might be Canadian, like by law. There's a difference between proving that, and I do think it could be hard to go back several generations or even to get birth certificates and everything. As we all know, as having submitted proof of citizenship applications, like they are very strict about having everything to like in the best possible or format in terms of documents. So I think maybe the department has calculated it would be a great ATIP request, Steve.
Oh my
yeah.
goodness. I can
Well, and on those
imagine what's
like
going to happen.
expectations, though, like I was reading the briefing note of when they did the public policy to waive temporary resident, like the to bulk grant temporary resident visas to people in 2022, and the number of people who declared asylum was something like triple what they expected. So I
Mhm.
do think their ability to forecast number, I don't know, I just get a bit
Mhm.
wary of, I understand what you're saying about the ability to prove one's a citizen, but when you have like Amandeep credibly talking about how we have no idea what the number could be, it could be
Mhm.
millions, I start to
Mhm.
think, okay, that may, I get a bit wary about it. I don't know what the
There's,
solution is, but
I mean, there's one thing I just want to point out. I mean, the majority of people who are going to benefit from this are U.S. citizens. We're not talking about people that culturally different. So part of me actually wonders if that's part of the reason why a lot of people are just staying quiet about the retroactive
I don't,
implementation.
I just think most people don't realize what's going on, like in the list of
I
things that
mean,
Canadians are talking about.
The other
Mhm.
factor, just keep in mind, is this is happening simultaneously with the US election as well.
Exactly.
And I don't know about your practice, but every time there's a US election, I get inquiries and consultations from millions of Americans saying, can I move up there?
Ryan Rosenberg at our firm registered the domain trumpugs.com,
Yeah.
and then we never utilized it. Let's shift from citizenship to maintaining permanent residence, which is people who immigrate to Canada and then leave. That's basically the
Yeah.
nutshell of why what do you have to do to maintain your permanent residence?
And it just seems so, like on the face of it, right? People assume like, well, I'm permanent now. I've been a temporary resident for a while, and now my status is solidified. I've metamorphosized into a permanent resident. And sometimes they don't know, or they're not aware that they have to respect their 730-day residency obligation in Canada. And, life in this global world as global citizens takes people abroad, and they then find themselves in a difficult position having to choose either to come back to Canada before it's not too late, hopefully, or attempting to come back in various states and being at risk of losing the status. So, yeah, it's an interesting topic for sure. You could write a few books about it.
Yeah, there are so many complexities around this too, such as, children that are taken away and then don't
Hmm.
get to come back until they're old enough to make choices for themselves. I've argued a bunch of those cases. And it was also
Hmm.
made so complex around COVID, where people left could come back because they literally could not, and then couldn't get a travel document to return, and what happened to those. Is that something that you discussed, some of those nuances in the book?
We tried to, but I think at the time we were writing that part of the book, actually, there wasn't a lot of jurisprudence yet out. I feel like when we'll have to go back and do a bit of like an update of the book, there may be more of that, but it's like totally a fascinating question.
Amandeep, I thought you were.
Well, I was going to say, Lisa, in the book, she put it really well. To maintain your permanent residence, there are two, you're basically on this mutual obligation. Canada gives you permanent residency and more or less all the same rights as a Canadian citizen, except the right to vote. In exchange, you must do two things. One, maintain good behavior. Two, maintain ties to Canada. And that can either be living in the country or meeting one of the residency exceptions.
One
Yeah,
thing
which are
I've
well, just quickly, what are the when you say residency exceptions, it's a bit weird because the Act actually like words them as they're part of the residency
Part of it.
obligation that can be
Hmm.
met not through physical presence,
presence.
Yeah.
which they are just, if you're abroad accompanying with a Canadian spouse or common law partner, those days count to the residency obligation, as well as if you're on short-term assignment to a Canadian business abroad.
Very short term, but yes. Hmm.
But that is a very interesting piece, this short-term assignment, and I think one of the very misunderstood components of the resident, like compliance with the residency obligation. I think people feel like
Absolutely.
they go abroad to work for a Canadian company and they're good. And I think that
Absolutely.
that's not what I mean, maybe you can speak about this one a bit.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely a common misconception. Like, okay, I was working, here and there in my Canadian position, traveling around Canada, but there was often was no assignment, or more often, what sometimes you see is a very long-term mandate for a Canadian company elsewhere, but there's really no end date. It's like an indeterminate assignment to basically market or do, undertake certain activities from another country. And so, unfortunately, at least for a number of people, federal court has come down hard, and the Immigration Appeal Division too, and the fact that this that many sorts of setups do not qualify as like this time limited assignment where the person actually has the possibility to be back, like to come back to a position in Canada. It's a pretty kind of a rare thing where there's still a position to come back to the same one that they left, a few years or months ago.
Yeah, it
I've
was a
always
trilogy of cases. And I know because mine was the middle case in the trilogy that set up that strict regime. It was Jiang, B, and 1. I don't remember the neutral citations. My case was
Yes.
B.
Oh,
Um,
cool.
Yeah, it's my most cited case, which unfortunately was a loss. And
Oh,
part of this trilogy of cases that made it strict, the case there, yeah, it involves someone who got his permanent resident status, went to China, actually got the job offer in Canada, but went to China, was occasionally corresponding with the head office in Richmond,
Mm-hmm.
and wanted to rely pretty much the entirety of their residency obligation on that employment. There was also in the judicial review a big incompetence of counsel component, but
Mm-hmm.
under the residency test that they sort of set forth, and like the big things that I always tell people after the trilogy is like, ideally, someone needs to be hired in Canada. They have to have active correspondence with the Canadian entity, and there has to be a firm plan that at the end of the assignment, they go back to the Canadian company, which was not met in B. In that case, what was interesting was the Department of Justice was actually arguing for short limit, like a 2 week limit, that assignment cannot be more than that,
Oh, wow. Two
which
weeks.
ultimately they didn't go with. But yeah, I'm familiar with the residency obligation jurisprudence because of it.
Yeah. Oh, it's a really a great read, the trilogy. So it's definitely great. Puts for good food for thought, and I wonder how the it'll continue to evolve. If there'll be any winners down the road. You never know.
I've always wondered whether or not we're going to see a similar tightening up on the accompanying a family member abroad. So accompanying a Canadian child or accompanying a
Ah,
Canadian spouse. And I'm wondering if you found any of that in your research.
They
who
were-
is accompanying who, right, Amandeep?
Yeah, yeah, that was the thing we kept
Can you
discussing.
accompany your infant abroad? And
Yeah.
are they going to try and say, no, in fact, you were the driver of that and it doesn't count?
The one concern I would have, I mean, if they did do that, for example, for spouses, all you're doing is you're potentially opening the door to more spousal sponsorships, which would be
Well, this is, yeah. I mean, the
it
who
would be a
accompanying who,
huge
there is a
waste of
very
time.
small sliver of IAD cases that do get into who's accompanying who.
Mm-hmm.
But this was always part of what was like, I found it frustrating. I don't do a lot of residency obligation cases anymore. There's another lawyer here who does, but like, it always kind of baffled my mind a bit that is that a positive factor in whether to grant an H&C appeal? The fact that there's someone who can just sponsor them. And on the one hand, you're like, okay, that, common sense would dictate that
Mm-hmm.
everyone's resources are going to be
Mm-hmm.
saved if we just let this person keep their status. But the government will sometimes take the position, well, then what's the problem? They can always just be sponsored.
That
Mm-hmm.
latter has been the feedback that I've had from members of the board quite unanimously.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, again, those appeals that I'm mentioning that I have seen them say, so what's the issue? You could just be re-sponsored. I have ultimately won the appeals, but I don't believe it's considered a positive factor. At least that's been my experience out here on the West Coast.
I agree. But you would wonder, like, it's just at a certain point, like you say, it's a question of resources. And, it's in everyone's interest, as you're saying, that we wouldn't spend, several, years for another application costs and time and families being separated. But,
And thousands of dollars litigating,
mhm.
a residency obligation appeal. I just wish these ones would get consented to, but anyways.
Mhm. And I know you've done a lot of them too, as you were saying, Deanna. So I don't know if you have any sort of tricks of the trade that you would share in terms of these types of dilemmas.
Not really. I mean, ultimately, I think you do need to make your case a robust case on humanitarian and compassionate grounds and not just relying on the fact that there could be a future sponsorship, just recognizing that that actually could be seen as a factor against you, that there's no real hardship in the permanent residency being revoked.
Absolutely. And I don't know if the board members really understand, or all of them anyways, the extent to which if someone loses their permanent residence, like it's not a given that they'll be able to come back to Canada. And, given the rigors of applying for a temporary resident visa, especially after you're a lost permanent resident, like I don't know. I always feel that that's sort of blown off a little bit in terms of sometimes is not really taken into account
Well,
when
and
cases.
especially now in like the modern era, if you're a Chinese citizen or an Iranian citizen, you could be looking at years of a security delay and the separation of family during that time.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And the time that I'm seeing this most often is when you're dealing with a child who left the jurisdiction because they were taken away by parents. And then as soon as they turned 18 years old, they came rushing back, and this is where they've always wanted to be, you know? And there is divided jurisprudence on that, whether or not, whether or not the fact that the parents made that decision should mean that that is a not unsympathetic factor, or the fact that they had no control over that should be a sympathetic factor. But often in those cases, this thing that we're saying about, well, they could just be sponsored again if they're still under the age of 22, and if one of the parents is a Canadian citizen or a permanent resident. But often there will be a gap of, let's say, 2 years where they can't, they won't necessarily get a study permit. They would do that as an international student. So again, you need to really make that case before the board, because the hardship can be very real, and it can be prohibitive of them actually pursuing what they had hoped to do all along.
Hey, you guys wrote the
Canada's
book on
laws.
this. You can probably answer this question then definitively.
Hmm.
Do you need to be in Canada to apply for a permanent resident card?
Good
I would say
question.
no. How about you, Amandeep? I would say no, but
I've done a few. They seem to have gone through. Generally speaking, I mean, they do want you to apply for a permanent resident travel document, but there is that one little thing. If your council applies for it, it's worked, and I've disclosed up front this person lives in the US,
that's it.
and they submitted it from my office, and it was applied for within Canada because it was submitted from my office.
So you did that in quotes. What's the issue that you're sort of raising when you say within Canada?
The application has to be submitted from within Canada,
According to the regulations.
but
So
it doesn't actually
not
state
undefined.
the person has to be in Canada. It's sort of a
But I think we could say IRCC has taken the interpretation that that person does need to be in Canada, and that's why we see the possibility only to apply for, online for the PR card, if the person's like in Canada, has an address in Canada. And then, you're supposed to use the permanent travel document application for those who are outside. Like when I have done this for clients who are not in Canada, I am like Amandeep, I disclose that all over, and I submit a paper application where you can annotate it more by hand to note that the individual's not presently in Canada physically, but would like to apply for a permanent resident card. I mean, the classic example could be someone who has a spouse that they've accompanied, a Canadian spouse they've accompanied abroad. They're relying on that time spent abroad with the spouse to maintain their 730-day residency requirement, but they want to have a permanent resident card. They're not just coming to Canada on a one-off and then going to apply for a PR card. They're going to keep living outside of Canada with their spouse. So these types of situations, they really need a PR card. And so that's where the role of counsel can be very useful, I think, to clients.
So Amandeep's described the situation where it's online and it's saying, hey, you can't do this. And Amandeep's able to explain through, I guess, cover letters or similar. Here's what the law is, go away questionnaire. It works. At the end side, do you have to be in Canada to get the PR card physically actually mailed to you?
Yeah. So what they'll do is they won't almost never mail it to council. What I find, they usually go to the visa office nearest to council. So the visa office, the CSC office nearest to council, say, you foreign national travel there to go pick up your PR card. And often when they go in, the very first question they ask, okay, list all your time outside of Canada. We want to take a look at it again.
So in that case, do they need to apply for a permanent resident travel document to get back?
Well, this is where for me it's a bit weird. Most of my clients are U.S. citizens, so they get to come over no problem. We usually apply early enough that the PR card, so the old one remains valid.
But otherwise,
otherwise, yeah, permanent resident travel document.
Or coming through the U.S., like, if they have a U.S. visa, like let's say they're visa required, I don't know, living in Asia, if they happen to have a U.S. visa, they could fly to a nearby border in the U.S. and fly to and then drive across the border in a rental car, private car, and answer any questions honestly. Yes, they're a permanent resident. They have a right of entry as a permanent resident, and then attend their interview to pick up their PR card like that. But where you have to be really careful is where clients are getting too close to their 730-day requirement, and then they could be subject to the mercy of Canada Border Services, who may decide that the proof that they see is insufficient, even though the officer who processed the PR card application inland thought it was sufficient. Border Services may reassess.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, is it just me, or are you guys also seeing that sometimes there is a suggestion of impropriety against people who are trying to apply for those PR cards in those circumstances, or that are approaching the port of entry and saying, please let me in, I'm coming to pick up my PR card?
I don't know if it's
Yeah.
right. I
Go
mean,
for it.
there's, the fact that you have to circumvent the IRCC website in order to apply is, automatically going to maybe lead some people to call it a legal loophole or something like that. It's really no different from flagpolling in terms of the government not wanting people to do it, but it's legally available. That's at least the way I view it. I don't know how you, Lisa or Amandeep.
I view it like that too, but I can tell you that as you're suggesting, IRCC does not view it in the same way. Like they beg to differ, and according to their interpretation lately, and in particular, they've come out a couple of times with the Canadian Bar Association has posed the question to them and said that we believe that the applicant needs to be in Canada physically to make the PR card application. But so it's just sort of where we beg to differ on an interpretation of the regulations. It's not ideal. But on the other hand, like, is IRCC the foremost expert on it? Well, no. But then again, if we did start to see refusals, I haven't seen them in these circumstances, but if we did start to see them, it could be preoccupying.
Or they
Yeah,
could
I mean,
change
I've
the law.
had,
Like I always come down to like,
huh,
if you don't like the way your law is being interpreted based on a plain reading of the law, like you have the power to change it. Like I don't understand. Like if what this years of argument is about, where the lawyers seem to generally come on top to their chagrin, change the law if they don't.
I always wonder if that's just posturing. I mean, they know it would be really impractical to change the law, just posture and just hoping enough people don't challenge those decisions.
Yeah, maybe.
That is something I have noticed sometimes in my practice, where it's like, we're going to challenge this decision. Why are you fighting it?
another one that I find really a curious question is about, you've now won your residency obligation appeal, but you are non-compliant, and now you need a PR card to be able to travel again. Any comments just about like the strangeness of then having to make a PR card application once you've just succeeded with a residency obligation appeal that was allowed on humanitarian and compassionate grounds?
Yeah, I think it's just one of those risky ones, right? Like you can put all the arguments before the IRCC officer from Sydney, Nova Scotia, including the positive decision, but there's always a little bit of a risk until the person has accumulated enough physical days, I think. Personally, I mean, maybe others think differently.
But do you generally wait until they are compliant before you make the PR card application if you're
I do. I
I
just,
depends for me. Yeah, really.
I do. I'm very risk averse on this one, because it's like, you don't want to go through that again, spend a bunch of money and try to do this. Just lay low for 2 years. Now, in most provinces, that's not an issue. Usually you can show up with your confirmation of permanent residence, get your healthcare card, get your driver's license, basically get everything in shape, and just lay low, use the confirmation of permanent residence, get your jobs, and it more or less works. You just don't travel. BC is a problem though. In
Yeah.
BC, you can't get your health card. You can't get your driver's license. Then it becomes, well, I don't know
Oh,
what to tell
really?
you. Yeah.
Yeah,
BC is the only province which does
it
this.
actually was a big shift that kind of changed the importance of the PR card, because as Amandeep was
Wow.
saying before, you could just use your confirmation of permanent residence.
Of course. Huh.
But now ICBC, the insurance provider here, the monopoly insurance provider here, requires PR card.
I even find
Wow.
though, like people registering for school, like they want to pay domestic tuition and they say, let's see your PR card. They won't accept a confirmation of permanent residency because they want to make sure that the person's compliant. And so I do find that there are a lot of circumstances in which universities and other public post-secondary institutions are saying
Yeah, I
they
did a
want.
deep dive on it years ago, and there actually was a like ministerial directive to start mandating that the PR card be required for pretty much the ID if permanent residence is needed. So that has shifted the importance of what used to just be a travel card. I take it that that's not the case in Quebec.
No, yeah, you can show up with your confirmation of permanent resident document, print out of your e-copper, and you can register for healthcare and all of that, or any confirmation of permanent resident document, like physical or the electronic version. So, I mean, in a way, it's just like the PR card, sort of a myth, anyways, right? It doesn't mean that because someone has a PR card, they're necessarily a permanent resident. They could have lost it. Because it is just, that travel document. And, so I think that actually like ICBC and whatnot should be informed, maybe like educated a little bit on what it means, these documents.
Yeah, I think it would have to be through actually like a ministerial directive. We can make it an
Yeah.
election issue. We
Or
can
like,
call up
I
EB or
mean,
Rustad or
yeah.
Well, actually, the
I'm gonna say
CBADC were
Falcon,
working
but
on
no. What's
submissions
that?
on this
Oh, really?
because of
Oh, are they?
yeah, just because of
CBABC, for those who don't know, is Canadian Bar Association of British Columbia,
yeah,
like the local immigration lawyer bar.
yeah. I mean, the person who's writing is supposed to be me, but
Oh.
I'm saying that because I've been promised to write it for 6 months. But one of the problems we're having right now is it's getting very hard to get like it's taking a long time in some cases to get a PR card. I don't know why,
Yeah.
but it's just the luck of the draw. And okay, I've got clients across the country. They're in any other province, it's not a problem.
Yeah.
They're in BC, it's a problem.
Yeah. Well, it's also like if it's somebody from a visa requiring country who does not have a US visa, to say, even though you've won your residency obligation appeal, you should live without a PR card until you've met 730 days to get the card. Like it's an issue for mobility rights that are protected under the Constitution. If you can't then register for school and get domestic students, it's a human rights issue in terms of, services customarily available to the public, and so there are significant issues there. So Amandeep, you go write that submission.
Yeah, write the letter. That's enough of this
We're
book.
I'm looking for a phone.
Yeah,
Enough of the
yeah.
book. Write the letter.
Yeah, you're done your book. We've got
We
new
want the
assignment
same
for
rights that Quebecers get.
Yes.
That's Steve's big theme for the day. Yeah. I don't know. Do you have any other questions, Steve? I found this very fascinating.
Yeah, I think we've covered both topics well.
Yeah. And with
Great chat.
no warning, thank you guys for jumping on in spite of our scheduling issues. It was great to chat with you both, and I'm sure the book will be a great success.
Thanks a lot. Great chatting.
And we'll see you in October.
Sounds good. A bientôt.
Bye.
Yeah,
Bientôt.
bientôt.
Bye.
Ciao.